Hi, and welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, speaker, and general explorer when it comes to customer and employee experience. I'm really interested in figuring out what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees. So with that in mind, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, authors and academics to uncover some clues about what it takes to build such an organization. Now, some of you may know the podcast as the Rare Business Podcast, but I decided to rename and rebrand the podcast recently. This is for a number of reasons. First one was to mirror the title of my book, Punk CX, which was published in June 2019. Two, because I'm a fan of punk music. And three, it's just more fun, right? Anyway, if this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then hello and welcome. And please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsko.com, as I've now completed over 300 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then welcome back and thank you. Anyway, that's enough for me right now. Let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Joe Macle, who is the founder and head of Engineering, no less, at End, and also an author of a couple of books. And he's here to talk to us about his latest book. Hey, Joe, how are you doing?
Hi, Adrian. I'm great, thank you.
So, Joe, we've talked in the past about your work, which I find fascinating and interesting and very insightful and useful and all these different things. But rather than me telling people about yourself, how about you give us a bit of a thumbnail sketch on you, your work, and what's important to you?
Sure. So I come from a design background, and I was I was doing that in the early sort of 2000s, and I had a couple of experiences that made me start to think differently about the consumer life cycle. And one of these was a voice recognition service. It was on Orange in the UK, and obviously this wasn't a very good voice recognition service. It used to handle all my messages and stuff on my mobile phone, and it was terrible in communication. So I'd ask it, "Hey, Wildfire," and it would say, "Sorry, I don't understand you. Sorry." And it would just do this constantly, that time after time, because it couldn't handle being out in a mobile space, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But the interesting thing for me in this was that I'd been sold this very visionary piece, this very visionary product. I was being told how to use it, and it just really wasn't living up to those things. In fact, I got to the point where I hated Wildfire so much. I didn't just want to end the service. I wanted to do something really destructive. I mean, this sort of links into your punk thing. I wanted to do something very destructive and end it. And I didn't know what that meant. And my vocabulary at the time was very immature around endings. So I didn't really understand what I was thinking. But I did know that I had laid this kernel to something which was very different. I was also teaching at the time, and I set one of those cliche projects about waste and rubbish in the world.
Right.
And all the students went away, and they all came back with more things, like little things, like a pencil that says "don't waste things," or a mug which says "don't waste things." And it philosophically didn't make sense. So I started digging around in what I called back then closure experiences. So,
right,
how do we end things? And this has matured over years. So I went through my career and done sort of like loads of tech jobs and stuff. And about 6 years ago, I left and really dug into endings. And I was fascinated with the social history of it. And it led me right back to the Industrial Revolution, the Plague, the Protestant Uprising, as the antithesis or the kernel of the idea of a different type of emotional ending in the consumer experience. And so the first book came out 4 years ago called Ends, and that's really the why we don't do endings. And the next book, Engineering, is just about to come out next in a couple of weeks on November the 8th.
Perfect.
And that book tells you how to design endings, and it's called Engineering.
Well, awesome. I mean, I've seen it, and I think it's cool. And I mean, I know I've also seen ends, and I think I think it's brilliant. I mean, it just speaks to a massive gap. People talk about how you can agree, kind of people, how you start things, but we don't pay way enough attention on how we end things.
Exactly.
I think it's really important. And so, can you tell me a little bit about the book? I mean, is it when you say it's a how-to book? What does that mean?
So when the first book came out, I was selling we've got to start looking at the end of the consumer experience as a place to change stuff. And I mean, this is incredibly timely right now as COP's going on in Scotland. And I'm going up to Scotland to speak at the Design Council event next week. So it's quite timely. People are really linking these things together because we've spent, and we know, and especially in the customer experience industry, we know how to sell stuff. We know how to make great customer experiences. We're not leveraging that skill set onto offboarding and endings. The end of the consumer experience is barren of emotion and meaning. For the consumer, this one product will be exactly the same ending as another product, and that will be in the waste, in the landfill. And until we start creating experience around that, which is meaningful, it has a conversation going on with it, it's tethered still and bonding to the provider. So we are creating richer, more meaningful experiences of offboarding. Then we're going to get proper traction. Because at the moment, I go to many circular economy discussions, and I'm still hearing people talking about material matter, i.e. plastics and others, and manufacturing processes. And I'm shocked about how lacking the conversation is about the customer and the consumer experience.
And do you think that's just it's a broader malaise, as it were, and that we don't actually talk about how things end very well?
Exactly. And that's what the first book really dug into. And what I was very inspired about is that the way we talk about endings, responsibility, and this goes across digital, service and product sectors, because we have the same problems in digital of lacking endings. I mean, if you dig into the GDPR issues, especially, I'll give you a good example around cookie consent. So everyone talks about cookies. People understand what a cookie is now, so they click a button at the beginning of the web experience. Now, you can give consent to cookies. There's two types of cookies. One's a session cookie, so it's just there for that one session. And the other one will sit on your computer for a period of time. Now, the gritty part of GDPR suggests that that's for 12 months, that should sit there on a maximum level. But I dig into these things and look into cookie consent end dates, which is it has to be a cookie has to have an end date. And and those end dates are shocking. I mean, I would have thought they would be in maybe a couple of years. But you'll look at the big players like Google, Amazon, there'll be 15 years that cookie consent is there. And then you get into another section ones, which is like almost one lifespan. So that's like 60 to 70 years. And then it goes into double lifespan stuff. So I see some cookies which are into the 120 years, etc. A couple of the longest ones I've seen, I saw one which is for 1,600 years. And then 1,600 years, that takes you back to the fall of Rome if you went backwards in time. The longest I found was 6,900 years of a cookie consent. So that takes you nearly to the year 10,000, or no, what is it? It was 7,000. It was 7,800 years.
That's crazy.
No one talks about endings on all sorts of levels. So it's shocking when you start digging into cookie consent, start looking at endings and how little we give a monkeys about all sorts of aspects of it. So
one of the things I wanted to kind of do is just to dig into a couple of things in the book, just to give people a flavor of it. But there was one passage in the early part of the book that just really struck me. And it said, many consumers have terrible hoarding habits because of a lack of discussion, instruction, and wider cultural norms about the end of the consumer life cycle. You then go on to highlight this by highlighting self-storage kind of use. I think it was particularly a use example or case example feature involving the US. I mean, can you tell us about that? Because I just thought I heard that story and I was like, I read that story and I was like, oh, me.
Yeah, so some of the biggest real estate growth areas in the US is offsite storage. So you'll have loads of people having offsite storage. It's super common in the US. The real estate market, when you dig into that, they have more real estate than loads of other groups put together. Like if you add up all the Starbucks, McDonald's, etc., offsite storage has more space than them. The other fascinating thing, I think, when you dig into hoarding, and I think GiftGaff done this bit of research. It was in the UK, but this was that on average, people will have 11 bits of e-waste in their home that they don't know what to do with.
Right, just electronic equipment.
Yeah, sorry, that's electronic equipment. So think of laptops, speakers, phones, etc. And these are have a particular problem around ending. So you've got, as much as we do it with furniture and we do into offsite storage, the bigger issue, because it's a lot smaller in physicality, is e-waste. So I'll happily I don't know what to do with my phone. I don't really want to sell it because I'm anxious about data issues. And also it might come in handy another time, etc. So what I do is put it in a drawer with the other 4, 5, 6 phones I've got hanging around in drawers in the home.
Yeah.
And so they took averages from different cities around the UK, and I think Birmingham have like so many phones in drawers. I think it was 10 phones on average in a household that should be chucked in a drawer. And that starts to make you think a lot about what we haven't got an answer for the end of the consumer life cycle to say, this is what you do then. What we tend to do is, this is how you buy a phone, and we've got loads of really good examples of that and how to do that. And we know profoundly how to sell a phone. We know how to operate a phone. We've got incredible quantities of people doing interaction design so people can operate that phone, the engineering around it, all of the background about that technology. And that offboarding thing, it is absolutely absent. There's a desert of knowledge, interest, and all sorts of other things. And what then happens in that vacuum, is that the issue falls to the feet of society. So we not only pick it up in our own societies in a human sense, but the environment pick up the impact of not dealing with plastics, for example. So when I go into these meetings with circular economy people and a lot of environmental discussions, we talk about material matter. That plastic got there through a consumer experience, but we won't talk about the consumer experience.
Yes.
So for an example, when I go out, I say to my wife, I'm going down the shops to buy some X, Y, and Z. I never say I'm going down the shops to get some plastic packaging.
Well.
So I never talk about plastic at onboarding. Why would I be talking about plastic at offboarding? So we've got to think about these things as a whole sequence of an experience.
And so is that is it just the environmental impact about kind of waste and things? Is that the emerging imperative for businesses, or do you think there's more to it than the ends than that? I mean, you talk about the offboarding kind of thing. I mean, like,
I see this firstly in terms of engineering and the ends as a consumer experience problem. That on every level, the consumer experience, whether you're producing digital, physical, or service sector products, there's an aspect of endings which is not being resolved coherently for the consumer experience. So you've got this period between usage and the end, and the end isn't really. I talk about the end as having 7 stages, and it goes through different aspects of that when I talk in the book. And the end is an experience that only the individual has. So my perception of an ending for example, an apple might be when I finished eating it, not when it goes in the bin. So there are different types of periods, and what we need to start thinking is what it means to the consumer, not necessarily in terms of the material matter or what happens as a processing sequence.
I mean, because I was thinking about that, and I mean, I know in the book you reference Netflix and how it approaches the ending of a relationship. And I wondered if you could tell me about that, just to kind of just to frame it in I guess in a real kind of example that might be familiar to people.
Sure. So Netflix has an ending which is super simple to go through as a consumer. So they're engaged with the ending as a company. They're very proud of it. So their CEO has talked about their simple, easy to end relationship. And of course, then the consumer can also start that relationship again. And in the background, there's stuff that goes on in terms of like not just GDPR, but other legislative digital issues around the world, which is about deleting their data, et cetera, et cetera. But for a period of time, Netflix can hold that piece of data about you, and you can open up your relationship with them quite easily again in a period of time. However, what I think is really important that Netflix is doing is engaging in the issue of endings, and they are engaging in it in a consumer experience sense, in a positive consumer experience sense. So let's flip to, say, a cable company in the US.
Right.
And if you go on to, I don't know, any complaining website and put in cable companies, then you're going to have a massive quantity of data and opinion and anger coming down. So what tends to happen with, and I also categorize these type of endings. So in the cable company example, you'll sign up at the beginning of the relationship to a service contract, and that service contract will have punitive break clauses in it, which anger people because they want to leave, and they want to leave at a certain point. And of course, there's stuff in the background like the physicality of the cable routers and stuff like that goes on. But the beginning point for the consumer is a legislative horror that they can't get out of, and they feel trapped and angered about this. But what's baffling is the intent to cause damage to the consumer relationship by this punitive legislative measures, which haven't been thought through as a consumer experience and a positive consumer experience. So what we need to start doing across all sorts of aspects is start to think about this as a period of time when your brand, your product is going to have an influence on the consumer experience and the consumer memory and the brand reputation. So if you go into consumer psychology, or in fact, any psychology, there's a thing called peak end rule, which I guess you've heard about by Daniel Kahneman. So many brands will be aiming for onboarding and usage experience and having great ones. So what you're aimed for is having repeated ones of that. And you won't be looking at the end because you want to do the hard sales targets, you want to do hard retention. And this retention stuff is the thing that I think is unraveling many consumer experiences and therefore eroding brand potential to have on a longer relationship and a better brand presence on a longer relationship. Because what we tend to do is approach everything in a consumer experience sense, that it's a single engagement. That we're going to do a great onboarding usage, single engagement, and to hell with the end.
Right.
Because what Daniel Kahneman says in terms of psychology is that these experiences are equally valued, the usage and the end. So peak in terms of usage and the end. So if you do a bad ending, they're never coming back.
And I think that's what's interesting about that, because I'm familiar with that idea from behavioral science. And it's also the interesting thing is, but sometimes people look at it and go like, oh, it's like a U shape, like a curve. It's like, oh, it's here. You start here, and there's the intensity is high at the beginning and at the end, and that's why you should focus on the end. But do you think also that there's like lots of little U's within that whole kind of like that whole journey, i.e., that there's like sub ends within the kind of the whole journey, if you know what I mean?
Yeah. So I define them as more task event completion type ending. So
there you go. Course, there's language to describe exactly the thing I'm talking about. Thank you.
Yeah. So you'll have, and I also have in the 8 different categories of endings that I describe, task event completion is in there because many services and product experiences you'll only use once as a completion. Especially sort of medical ones, you don't want to. Hopefully you won't use them again.
Yes.
But the within any consumer experience, that if you're using repeated experiences of that, you're going to have a task event completion. So, let's say Netflix, watching a film and then turning the telly off is probably a task event completion.
Or if you have like a car, you buy a car and you have to book it in for a service or something.
Yeah, exactly. So those ones I often think have been considered as part of that consumer life cycle and that consumer experience. Like, how do you put your car in for a service? I mean, car manufacturers are all over that. They want you to come back that first year, add in loads of benefits and really embed that brand promise.
Yes.
But the offboarding experience, I mean, staying with cars, when Kaya cars came to market like a few years ago with the 7-year warranty, that was incredibly disruptive thing for the marketplace, which was majority of people were doing 2-year warranties, which was really a product of materials approach. Kaya says 7 years, and that's a totally different mindset for the consumer. So you've gone beyond product materials. You've gone to what's the lifespan? How far can I imagine this product going? And what's great about that is that consumers find it hard humans find it hard to think beyond 5 years. So that's why you get those cliche job interview questions or or financial advisor questions about 5 years.
Yes.
So 7 years is like this sort of dark, sort of unknown area. It's almost like death. It's like a product death, meaningless void. And what Kaya Cars have done is said, in that void is the end, and we're here with you for that moment in 7 years' time. And then they've essentially created a funeral, which is bonding experience for the consumer. It means that those materials are going to come back to Kaya, not get chucked into other sort of recycling, scrap metal sort of things. And then Kaya can then break those things down in a far more accurate way. And since then, since offering the 7-year warranty, their global market share's doubled. Their consumers are amongst the highest loyal customers, and they love the Kaya in terms of the customers' preference about the product itself. They like the 7-year warranty above every other aspect of the product offering. So whether that be price point, design, etc., the 7-year warranty is there. And that, I think, is a really interesting ending.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating because it's one of those things. It just takes, I mean, going back to psychology, and I know that I can't remember the actual study, but there's this idea that the memories that we hold for the longest are the ones that are associated with, things like disappointment, failure, risk, uncertainty, and things, because it's all a function of this idea of rumination. We can have anything that is involved with, why me, what if, kind of all that type of stuff. Those things, because it's linked to a threat to survival, as it were. Those memories apparently stay with us for longer than any other kind of memory. But if you take those things away from people, take that risk, that disappointment, that uncertainty away from people, then that's going to stick with them.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of data around people being more comfortable signing up for something, knowing how to get out of that thing as well. So knowing the end is really beneficial to sales, for example. Knowing the off ramp, for example. And I can't remember who done it. Is this guru on sales that talks about like the benefits of showing the off ramp, not just the on ramp. How do you get out of this relationship? And because when people know that off ramp, that ending, they trust that brand a lot more. Yeah, to be able to get out and commit if they want to that consumer relationship.
So Joe, break this down for us. I mean, like, how should people be going about creating kind of better kind of ends? I mean, in the book, do you kind of go through you talk about it being a how-to book? Is there a process, a flow to this? And I mean, and who's the book kind of really aimed kind of for? I mean, it feels like to me that everybody should be thinking about this, but is it actually targeted at a particular set of people?
So after doing the first book, and I mean, on one level, the first book was, I didn't want to write a book years ago when I first started looking into it. I thought it was going to be a Medium article and a blog post. And when I started digging into it, I thought, oh my God, this is really important, and we need to change thinking about this. So I thought, because I'm quite dyslexic, so it was quite a challenge. And so I started writing this. I wrote one chapter, then I thought, oh, well, maybe I can write another one. So I wrote this book about how important, how we aren't thinking correctly about all sorts of problems, all of the ills of consumerism.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to start changing that. And so the first book was very much the why. And the second book is really a response to doing doing lots of conferences, lots of training workshops over the last 4 years, and sort of assembling how can we do endings better.
Right.
And in that time, I've had loads of conversations across different sectors, and I've done a lot of research around all of the background of this. So the engineering book is essentially it's the beginning of like engineering for endings, and that combination is the engineering, obviously the word. And we need to create a new sort of genre of consideration around this, and start to design and create and build consumer offboarding experiences. And so in the book, I talk about these 4 components, which we have these characteristics in the gap of consumerism at the end. And these are the sources of the ills of consumerism. Right. And after that, then I build up more of a pattern of how we start to challenge these. And there's some big fundamentals that I don't think we can deal with on a day-to-day basis. And some of those are around identity and responsibility, and also about how we measure endings is very different to how we measure onboarding and usage periods. And some of the tools that we use need to change. And these are big arching questions. So there's a couple of chapters about these big meta questions. And those are for sort of policy people, or they're interesting. I found them really interesting to write. And they're big picture things which are quite inspiring. And then the sort of latter half of the book gets into the practicalities of how we design endings. So I've set out the different types of endings. So there's 8 types of endings which have different characteristics across, and they all go across digital service and product sectors. So if you think about a sort of a task event completion we were talking about earlier, all our disposable products are task event completion. If you have a coffee and that's in a disposable cup, then that cup has one task to do, and that's keep your liquid, your coffee liquid, in a container so you can drink it, and then it's thrown away. And so some of these characteristics of different types really help you understand what product you're offering. Right. And then we go into how that happens across a sequence. So what happens at the beginning of the end? So that I call it the crack of doubt, and that comes from a woman called Helen Rosa Barr, who'd done loads of work around role exit. Really fascinating. It goes from things like divorce to how you leave your job roles, etc. But it has a really interesting angle on, I think, a relationship to the beginning of the consumer relation, the beginning of the end of the consumer relationship. Right. And so there's 7 phases generally that consumers go through. And then there's loads of different stuff in there, like transaction models. They load up a certain relationship between the consumer and the provider that will take you through the end, but they establish a power relationship. So in some different transaction models, the consumer has the influence, and others, it's really horrible towards the consumer. So those are also in the book. And then finally, it will tell you the different the process you should go through if you're going to do this, and how different businesses can approach it. So if you're in digital and you've got a small team in a startup, it's probably not going to be a big effort for you to really think about endings, But if you've got a big manufacturing business that sends out physical products, then there's lots to think about. Yeah. And, there's a lot to think about in terms of the back end and bringing products back, et cetera, et cetera. So there's stacks in the book, and I also go into a bit around businesses and some of the fundamentals of how we value consumer experiences, and that so much of the value associated with the consumer experience is for the moment of the present. We don't talk about decay of matter or decay of lingering assets and elements that then undermine the consumer. And that can be across physical, digital, service sectors. And so I think that needs to change. So I talk about valuing and how we need to measure stuff. So the return on investment of investing in endings, for example, is a question that a lot of people ask. So there's loads in the book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's fascinating, and it reminds me of a conversation that I had with a wee while ago with a lady called Pauline Wilson, who was I think she was a CEO at Virgin Holidays, and what she did.
I've heard of her. Yes,
and what she did, she described a situation where she, when she took on the role, her and one of her marketing colleagues, I think, went on holiday undercover to kind of understand.
Of all the jobs, that sounds an awful research job.
It was.
I go on holiday.
It was kind of like, it was a hard
day at the office.
Indeed, but I think what they found, because they ended up getting busted halfway through, because they ended up talking to too many people, kind of almost like conspicuously walking around with clipboards. But anyway, what they did notice is they noticed that because they're dealing, it's a primarily UK based operation.
Yeah.
Dealing in transatlantic holidays, whether to the Caribbean or to the US or whatever. And if you think about that, kind of the sort of the flight schedules of that, then at the end, what happens is and they generally deal with kind of beach holidays. And so at the end, what normally happens is you check out of the hotel at like 10 or 11 in the morning, but you would fly late afternoon because you'd fly overnight and then arrive the following morning, as it's kind of like, right. And so you end up with this gap where people are checked out and they're like going, I'm still at the beach, but I can't go to the beach because I've checked out and all my stuff is in my suitcase and I've got 5-6 hours to kick around. And what they ended up doing is they realized that actually that's leaving this, it's almost a bitter taste, or there's a real lull in the whole experience. And so what they ended up doing is they created this pilot called a departure beach.
Nice.
Which was an annex to the hotel that they were staying at, where people could go and had a choice. They can go, actually, I can check in here. I can have another sort of day at the beach. They would take care of my bags. I'd have access to all these kind of facilities and make sure my bags got to the airport, and I could take a shower and change of clothes, and they even give me a wet bag to put my kind of, wet trunks and stuff, or wet swimming costume kind of in. And then they'd kind of shuttle me to the airport to get there to make sure I got to my flight on time. So you could have another day at the beach.
Perfect.
But don't have before you get on the flight. And it was just like a roaring success. But I think it's exactly to that point around that's engineering in action, I think.
That's such a good example. I have heard of Pauline, and I wish I'd got in touch with her, because I only heard with her a couple of months ago, and a lot of the work on the book had been done. I think what it shows is that if you have a hole at the end, that big gap that she observed, and that's the stuff that horror falls into. It's that sort of idle thumb stuff, and it never ends up well. You need to show purpose and commitment. And I think that's the difference between the Netflix thing and the cable company thing, is that Netflix assume people are going to leave, so they've designed something for it. And cable companies trap you in because they don't want you to leave. But the damage is long-term, it's critical, and it will ruin your brand. You might trap someone in for one more cycle, but you'll certainly ruin your brand in the long term.
Brilliant. So, Joe, I also wanted to, is there anything else that you want to add or highlight that we've kind of like missed out about the book before I ask you to take a step back? And then
I thought maybe one thing we should have talked about was, or I'd like to talk about, is the obsession with retention that I think comes from, and I see a lot of problems in endings with retention. So businesses tend to talk about retention a lot. And the aggression in retention, I think, undermines a lot of the capability of having a good offboarding experience. So I think the retention thing comes out of a business model that is 20 to 30 years old. It is pre-web, that now most businesses will be getting a consumer to be attracted by digital automation through sort of sending them the right type of messages. We've automated onboarding, and attracting companies through digital advertising, etc. We have got great digital onboarding stuff. So you sign up on a website and you've really crafted that. And all of these things have been automated. They're user-centric, and we're getting great benefits in terms of business yield out of them. And at offboarding, we resort to this 20 to 30 to 40-year-old retention model, which is we're going to stop you leaving. We're going to throw paperwork at you, and we're going to charge you for it. When we've actually automated onboarding, digitized it, made it totally light, but we've got the offboarding like we're going out doing manual sales still. So we need to automate, engage, and make a really good experience out of that is a really good brand promise. And it takes that brand emotionally and keeps it with you properly instead of beating people up as they leave the party. So I wanted to come in on that because I think that would be an important and interesting maybe point of view for your listeners.
No, I think that's really interesting, and it reminds me of a quote that I collect quotes, but one of which I saw from a gentleman by the name of Dharmesh Shah, who's one of the co-founders of HubSpot. He apparently once said, "We want to make it emotionally difficult for our customers to leave, but procedurally easy."
I think that's brilliant. I love that. I mean, no one wants to see their customers go, but I often say in the presentations I do that I'm married, and that ends in one of two ways: death or divorce. Yeah, procedurally, that's super simple, but emotionally, I'm not looking forward to it. So I think that's a great quote from Dharmesh.
Yeah, no, I think and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, whether you call it retention, whether you call it loyalty, whether you call it success, I think we need to be thinking about kind of these things and what and actually dealing with the idea that the experiences will end.
Absolutely.
And if we don't deal with that, then there's a big gap in our thinking.
Maybe another thing, I talk about these in the book. There's some good examples in there. One's from 3 Denmark, and if you're in the telecoms industry, everyone thinks that, if you make it easy to leave, then more people will leave. And there's no evidence for that when you dig into it. If you make it easier to leave, there's actually a lot of benefits you get in terms of feedback is far more accurate. So 3 Denmark created, they called it the beautiful exit. And everyone was quite anxious when they released it. So including the CEOs, everyone's thinking, is everyone going to leave? And, they start looking at the data. No one else left, but everyone was a lot happier leaving. And the impact on your call center staff, not only emotionally, because it's horrible having discussions about people leaving and trying to stop them leaving, because that's a really horrible engagement to have as an employee. The workload off them was an enormous lift, and they got into making the product better and really supporting the customers instead of trying to trap them in the relationship. And the difference is night and day for a lot of the way the businesses operate. So really think about the benefits of making a good ending.
So I guess that's the kind of the if you were to give anybody listening a piece of advice, is apart from buy the book, obviously, then I guess the advice would be dig into the endings and actually, or maybe ask yourself a question: have I considered the end of the experience I'm creating?
That's exactly. So in the book, I do talk about what's your first step, and actually, it's talking about endings. How often do you talk about endings at your business? So, how many sales meetings have you been to? Probably once a week. And how often have you talked about the offboarding experience of the company? Probably never. And you need to change that so you're making an incredibly good ending for your customers who choose to leave.
Well, I mean, I guess also the other kind of thing about it, because if you want to apply a sort of different lens to it, you can say, well, here's the thing: if you make it easy for somebody to leave, or make the ending kind of good and memorable, as it were, then because they might leave for different reasons, i.e., their needs have outgrown the product, or it's just moved on, it's shifted, or whatever it might be. But if you made it easy for somebody to leave, and the right sort of a good sort of experience, then it's pretty likely if they encounter somebody who might be in the same sort of like position as they were when they bought your product or service, they're probably like to go, you should speak to them.
Absolutely.
They're pretty cool to deal with. And so then you get into a whole advocacy type of thing, and reputation and all that sort of stuff. And it's like, it's so important, rather than just going, I make it hard to leave. And then you go, well, actually, you got definitely one less advocate out there.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at it through the lens of, are you a business that is a single engagement model business or a multiple engagement model business? And if you're a multiple engagement model business and you approach things like that, then you have to think about endings, because you can't leave your customers with a bad taste in their mouth at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
So before we go, however,
yes,
we
forgot this bit, didn't we?
Oh,
the punk bit.
Nearly bit. So, as you know, I've been explaining, I've been doing some of this ongoing word association, kind of like collection research, call it what you will, since I published my last book, the latest book, kind of like Punk CX. So I've got 2 quick questions for you. First one is, what one word would you use to describe a more punk approach to customer experience?
So I think it's about that. There's something around, and now this isn't going to be very quick, is it? Because now I have to think about a particular word. But I very much like that creative rawness of questioning stuff that is been established for years, decades, centuries even, and I think the braveness of trying to confront that. So I think punk done that really well. It was disrupting incredibly embedded class system in the UK and questioning all sorts of authority and how to do that. And it done that on such a passionate, big, energetic scale. And I think there's combinations, there's similarities, I think, between the questioning the end in consumerism, is that hopefully I'm bringing that sort of punk ethos to something that hasn't been questioned for centuries, decades, etc. And so I think it's about questioning, or maybe that's too soft a word. Challenging, I think, is the challenging. And I like that aspect of that, and challenging the norms.
Perfect. Thank you. And so second one is, what company or brand do you think epitomizes that sort of punk ethos?
Now, that's a difficult one. I think especially since the last 2 years has been so disruptive for everyone, that it's hard to think of anyone who hasn't had to be very brave about pivoting and being very light and creative. And almost everyone has had to adopt a punk ethos. So I think maybe it isn't necessarily a company, but maybe the World Health Organization has had to do so much in terms of pivoting, and the politics they've had to navigate has been shocking. And I think there's something to be said about how good they've been able to rapidly help everyone across the earth in a very creative sense. So it has been a matter of stitching things together with, what's the punk pin? A
safety pin.
A safety pin in it, and I think that's it's the Who and the safety pin.
Yeah, I think I like that, and it's because it's I like that a lot. That's great. So, Joe, that's all I have for you today. I just want to say, congratulations on the new book. I think it's really interesting. I think you're becoming Mr. Ends, and I think and I think that is it's an important and interesting space, and one that doesn't get looked at as much as it needs to. And so just want to say congratulations on the book, and thank you for spending some time with us today on the podcast. That's been awesome.
Thanks ever so much, Adrian. And I've really, really enjoyed it. Always a pleasure chatting to you.
Well, that was cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I did, and I always do actually, because I always learn something new when I speak to some of these amazing kind of people. And it's always something new that I can incorporate into my writing, speaking, workshops, and other sort of advisory work that I do. Now, if you're interested in learning about any of that sort of stuff, then you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinscoe.com. But one final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or Spotify or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do tune in again soon. All the very best. Cheers. Bye.